Hi there, and welcome to today's Lightning Talks. I'm Rose Sawvell, and I work on community and education here at solo.io. I am excited to introduce our Lightning Talk speaker for the day, so please help me extend a warm welcome to Nina Polshakova, who will be sharing information about onboarding virtual machines into Istio Service Mesh. So over to you, Nina.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Rose. So my name is Nina Polshakova, and I'm an engineer on the Gloo Mesh team at Solo. And today I'll be talking about onboarding virtual machines into the Istio Service Mesh. So in this talk, we'll first go over an overview of the virtual machine architecture in Istio today, and then we'll do a deep dive of the current virtual machine onboarding process and understand why certain steps are required. And then finally, we'll introduce our new MeshETL tool to help with the onboarding process, which simplifies a lot of the manual steps that are required today. So I think it's fair to ask first, why integrate virtual machines in the mesh in the first place? So you may have legacy applications running on virtual machines, and you want to add those legacy applications into the mesh to be able to add all the benefits that Istio provides, such as applying uniform policies, visibility, and security. And in this approach that we're going to talk about today, we're operating under the expectation that the VM will participate 100% within the service mesh. And what that means is we're going to support traffic in both directions, from the cluster to the VM and from the VM to the cluster. So in order for a VM to be onboarded into the mesh, it needs to do one of two things. First, it needs to establish an authenticated session with the control plane. And secondly, it needs to be aware of services running on the Kubernetes cluster, and vice versa. The services running on the VM need to be visible to the pods in your cluster. So there are two examples we're going to take a look at. The first example is the single network architecture. So in this example, we have both our Kubernetes cluster and our virtual machine running in the same network. So what that means is Istio is deployed on the Kubernetes cluster. We have an east-west gateway, and all the control plane traffic will flow through the gateway, but services can communicate directly with one another. So once the VM is onboarded, the XDS updates and initial bootstrapping will happen through the gateway, but then a service on the virtual machine, like service B, can talk directly to service A. And this is slightly different from the multi-network setup, where we have, in this example, our Kubernetes cluster is in one network and our virtual machines are in another network. So here, Istio is also installed in the cluster, but now both the control plane traffic and the service mesh traffic are going to go through that gateway. So in this case, the service, like service B on the virtual machine, can't talk to service A directly. It needs to get, it needs to go through the gateway to hit service A. So on a larger scale, how does Istio actually represent those resources that represent the VM? There's three separate parts to representing a VM in Istio. The first one is the workload group. And this resource is the grouping of virtual machine workloads that share similar properties. So for example, the ports, network, locality values. And you can think of this similar to a deployment in Kubernetes. And related to that, the workload entry is similar to a pod in Kubernetes because it represents a single instance of the VM workload. So the workload entry will have the instance-specific address, the labels, etc. The workload entry, however, doesn't provision any resources. The only thing it does is tell Istio where the VM is. And related to that, the service entry is what actually enables adding additional services to Istio service registry. So inside the service entry, you will select the workload entry as shown in this diagram. So the service entry will select the workload entry, but it has no relationship to the workload group, which is the higher level grouping of specific workload entries. So like I mentioned in the first slide, one of the requirements for onboarding a VM that's very important is authenticating with Istio. And the way that the Istio onboarding process does this is by creating a short-lived service account token. So on the Kubernetes cluster side, you create a service account, and this will create a token that gets copied over to the VM. And this token is what's used in the initial CSR request to sign the private key and public cert for the VM. Like I mentioned, the service account token is supposed to be short-lived and only used for the initial bootstrapping process. It shouldn't be reused after that. And this is how the VM is able to survive restarts without needing to redo the whole bootstrapping process. So this kind of illustrates the other flow of this process. So once you have the token and you copy it over to the virtual machine, the Istio agent on the virtual machine will check and see if Etsy certs has a valid certificate. And if no certificate exists, then it will use the bootstrap token, the trust domain, the CA address, and the root certificate that were copied over to to establish first a TLS connection with the CA, and then send a CSR request attaching the service account token as the bearer token in the authorization header. So once the CA approves this CSR request and issues a certificate, the agent finally receives a certificate and can save it in Etsy certs, and then it never has to go through this bootstrapping process again. What are the current steps that we kind of touched briefly on a lot of these, but what is necessary to onboard a virtual machine? So there's some steps that have to happen on the cluster side, and then there are also some steps that have to happen on the virtual machine side. So the first step, it seems easy enough. You just have to install Istio. But as we saw in the multi-network and single network examples, that also means you have to have an east-west gateway set up with an external IP that your VM can talk to. You need to have Istio-D exposed. So that means all the control plane traffic can flow through the gateway. And you also need services exposed in your multi-network example. So if you have a multi-network setup, your VM needs to be able to talk to services. And in order to do that, you need to expose them on the gateway. Step number 2, you have to create the workload entry, or sorry, the service account. And this service account is the thing that's used in the initial bootstrapping process that I mentioned in the previous slide. So that has to get created on the Kubernetes side and then copied over to the VM. The third step is creating all the resources that actually tell Istio where the VM is. So like the workload group that we talked about before, the workload entry, which identifies the specific VM instance, and the service entry, which identifies the service running on the VM. And then once the Kubernetes cluster side is complete, we have to do the VM side. So we have to copy all the configuration files, copy the tokens. So in the configuration files, we have stuff like how does the Istio mesh on the cluster, how is that configured? And we also need information like how is the agent going to be run on the virtual machine? So that includes information like what the discovery address is, what the health check probes you have set up, what the authentication options you have, and also like more agent-specific stuff, like what inbound ports you're going to capture. So the last thing before you can run the Istio sidecar is you also have to append the discovery address to Etsy hosts. And this is in the manual setup step. So this is what the proxy uses to reach Istio-D for XDS updates. And then finally, once all of those steps are done, you can run your Istio sidecar. And currently there's only 2 sidecars supported, CentOS and Debian. So taking a look, there's a lot of, at a high level, there's a lot of steps and a lot of places where things can go wrong. So we've introduced a new tool called MeshTL VM Onboard, which kind of handles all the VM onboarding steps for you, in addition to like adding safeguards and checks to make sure your Istio installation is correctly set up. So here, you still are responsible for installing Istio, setting up your gateway, making sure the correct services are exposed. But once you have that done, MeshTL VM Onboard will handle both the Kubernetes setup part and the VM setup part for you. So the command looks a little like this. So we have 2 parts to it. First is the actual onboarding command, which you can use to specify, what your VM name is, where the namespace of all the VM resources will live. And then we also have a sanity check command that just validates that the onboarding process was successful. So I think we'll go into the single network demo because I think this illustrates the command very well. So in this demo, we're going to have 2 services running on our Kubernetes cluster. This is going to be a JKE cluster and the same network as the Google VM. So what that means, if you recall, is that the services can talk directly to one another once the onboarding process is complete. So here I have Hello World, which was just going to be a simple hello service. And then we're going to have a review service, which has a rate limit policy applied. And then on the Google VM instance side, we have a rating service running, which we will hit from the traffic. from the cluster. So yeah, let me exit this and pull up the demo. So yeah, so here we have, on the top, we have our cluster. So first we're gonna set up some helper environment variables to identify where our VM is running. So this is specifying the host name and user name that I will use to provision the VM. And the next step is we're going to see what is actually installed on our cluster. So we have Istio set up, and we have our east-west gateway already set up, and I've already exposed Istio to the gateway. So when I look at my Istio services, I can see that the east-west gateway has an external IP set, which I can use to send the XDS updates and do the initial bootstrapping process. So now for the onboarding step. So it's very simple because it can run in one command. And what I do here is I specify the VM name, the namespace, and the service account. And these are all optional. If the name and service account aren't provided, we'll use the VM address to do a default. But let's run this because we're running low on time. So the first thing this command does is performs checks of our system. So it checks that the east-west gateway is set up and Istio is exposed. And now it generates all the workload entry, workload group configurations, and now it sends the configuration to the VM. And here, now we can do a sanity check to make sure that our VM is in a good state. So this actually gets the logs from the VM. So down here, I have the VM running, and I can look at the Istio logs that say the same information, but this is more distilled down, so it's like an easy summary to look at. So according to this, our VM is successfully onboarded. So now we can test it out by sending some traffic. So like I mentioned in the previous slide, I have Hello World set up and book info. And here I have Istio injection labeled for both of those namespaces. So when I send a curl request from the VM to the cluster, I should get a 200 response, and we do. The second part of this demo is applying a rate limit policy to our reviews. So we have a simple rate limit policy that selects the review's destination. And we have set the rule on this rate limit policy to only allow 2 requests per day. So when I curl from the VM to the cluster, well, first it's good to check if our VM actually got this endpoint. So you can check that by looking at the Envoy clusters that get sent over, and we can see that we have reviews here already. So so now I can curl reviews directly. The first time goes through. The second time should also go through. But the third attempt should be rate limited. So we can see we get a 429 response. So now let's set up ratings to run on the VM side. So we have the book info rating service that's going to be running on 9080. And on the cluster side, we're going to set up a simple service that that selects our workload entry that we've defined through the onboarding process. So here we're selecting port 9080, and we select the workload entry. And then we can curl this from a pod in our system. So okay, so we run the pod, and then this will take a while. And then we can do curl hello VM namespace 9080, and then ratings. And we should get a 200 response that gets hit on our VM. So let's go back to the slides. So unfortunately, I don't think we have time for the multi-network demo, but we can talk about it briefly. So here we have, sorry, am I still sharing my screen? Yes, okay. Sorry. So here we have the same setup, but the only difference in the multi-network demo is we're running in an AWS EKS cluster. So the host name will be set for the external IP instead of having a static IP. But as I can show later, is that this the setup step through meshctl will be completely identical as it was in the single network example. So the command you run is identical. The only thing that has to change is the provisioning behind the scenes changes it to use the host name instead of the IP directly. So some final thoughts. So we talked about current limitations with manually onboarding virtual machines. So one of the first obvious ones is there's a lot of steps and a lot of things can go wrong. So we need to make Kubernetes calls and in addition to that, there's, we talked about authentication, we talked about setting up Istio correctly. And one of the issues with authentication is you need to make a Kubernetes API call to create the service account and then copy that over to the VM. There's some hostname constraints. So the version we have here is using Istio 1.3. So hostnames are supported when you're exposing Istio-D and services through the gateway. But in earlier versions, there are some limitations on that. And we've also introduced the meshctl workflow here, which simplifies and adds safeguards to a lot of the manual onboarding steps that have to happen. And this will be available in Gloo Mesh Enterprise v2 and above. So I encourage you to check it out. And then I think the final thought is just before you start onboarding virtual machines, I think it's useful to consider what your requirements are and if you need the VM to be fully participating in the mesh or if a one-way solution works for your setup. So yeah, I think we're right out of time, but I'll be in the chat to answer any questions. And yeah, I hope you have a great SoloCon.
All right, thank you, Nina. That was some great information about onboarding VMs, and thanks also for the demo.